from sores on his body, whose friends believe him suffering because he did something wrong. After his friends tell him he must no longer be an upright person, and he's no longer blameless, after he wishes his own death, God interrupts Job, calling from a whirlwind. God demands that Job be brave and respond to God's questions, the questions that I just read, and more. The questions are rhetorical, though, intending to show how little Job knows about creation and how much power God alone has. When I first wrote this message, I had a whole page or more, sort of recounting the book of Job, but I'm trusting that we know Job, the story of Job, where God and Satan had this conversation, and Satan challenged God, saying that Job only likes you because you're good to him, because he's got a lot. And God said, go ahead and test him. And then Job was tested mightily. My sermon was 10 pages long. It's usually only 6, so I cut that part out, trusting that we know the story of Job, or you might want to look at it, to read it again, to refresh your memory. I found a story about a man named Bill, and I think it relates a lot to Job's story. Bill and his twin boys were working on a project while his wife Carol Ann and 4-year-old daughter Sarah Kate went horseback riding. 15-year-old Jessica was going to come home soon from a mission trip to Mexico. A bit later, while Bill was putting away tools, he heard a faint, though barely audible cry off in the distance. He was sure it was somebody yelling. Dropping his tools, Bill hurries off in his truck, tires screeching. Honing in on that cry, Bill finds Sarah Kate wandering in the pasture, crying uncontrollably, and Bill asks, "Is Mommy okay?" And Sarah Kate answers, "No! No!" Bill looks up, and he sees the horse in the next pasture over. Racing there, he finds Carol Ann face down on the ground, motionless. Turning over her limp body, he sees blood trickling out of her mouth. Just then, the 9-year-old twin boys drive up in the 4-wheeler, and Bill yells for them to hurry, to go home and call 911. It takes lifelike 45 minutes to get to the pasture, leaving Bill holding his unconscious wife. Piecing the story together later from Sarah Kate, Bill learns that the horse had been eased into a steady gallop when it tripped and stumbled, slamming mother and child hard into the ground. Carol Ann's foot was still in the stirrup when the horse rose from the fall and dragged her unconscious for about 100 yards. Though initial reports were optimistic that she might regain consciousness, on day 3, the doctors informed Bill, who had not left Carol Ann's side, Bill was told that she probably would not make it through the night. He arrived home after midnight, exhausted emotionally and physically, and he shared the news with his daughter Jessica. And then one child after another woke up to the news that Mommy might never be coming home. Each one then cries him or herself to sleep. The next day, when Bill goes to the hospital, he's told that there isn't much time. He takes Carol Ann's hand and says his sweet goodbye as she slips from coma into death. He can't bring himself to let go, but he knows he must because he's got 4 motherless children that look solely to him for care. In the hours and the days following Carol Ann's death, well-intentioned friends demand a retelling of the story of his loss. Slammed by a blizzard of pain and desperate for relief, Bill is now planning Carol Ann's memorial service. The constant dribble of conversation around him at the funeral home seems surreal. Laying with his wife in bed just a few days ago, Bill now spends a few final minutes at the casket, reaching in to touch Carol Ann one last time. She's lowered into the ground at the gravesite. Bill has no idea of the depths of suffering to which he will yet descend. And in addition to running his own company, Bill was now leading an adolescent MASH unit on the front lines in his own home, in a world that callously kept spinning with or without his wife and without the mother of his children. Night after night, the family wept and slept together on the floor, dreading another morning that would begin another day of pain. Responsibilities at home and work accumulated, threatening to push Bill toward collapse. In the dark of night, he would sink into his favorite chair exhausted, wondering if he could survive another day. As weeks turned into months, the constant reminders of Carol Ann and their life together unbearably filled every room and every acre of their homestead. Sometimes Bill would lie awake at night and instinctively call for Carol Ann, forcing the agony of her absence upon him. I don't know if you can relate that to the story of Job and all that he lost, and all he lost so quickly. The story that I just told you is found in the book Divine Nobodies by Jim Palmer. Divine nobodies are us. We're nobodies, but there's a divinity within us that we need to remember and claim. Palmer is a friend to this family. A former pastor, Jim Palmer, was there walking through the final days of Carol Ann's life and the pain the family was going through after her death. Jim wrote Bill's story, as I read it to you. He wrote it up to this point and sent Bill a draft of the story for him to read. Bill agreed that it expressed as much as a few paragraphs of words were capable of that described the devastation and agony of Carol Ann's tragic death. Jim's first draft then delved into the issues of why God allows suffering. Jim, the author, was personalizing his own pain and doubt and fear, realizing he himself could be just a phone call away from losing a family member, realizing he was vulnerable to the loss and suffering, and knowing that God doesn't change that. Jim wondered if he really wanted to know that God who doesn't stop suffering. Jim realized God is evidently not there to protect him from pain. Jim had believed, he grew up believing that accepting Christ, doing church, being good and obeying were paying into some sort of divine insurance policy that would take care of him with at least some minimal coverage. If that's not true, then what is this Christian walk about anyway? Jim wanted to know if he could lose his family, his health, his job, his dignity, then what good are God and a life of sacrifice? Though Bill concurred with Jim's description of his pain, Bill was shocked by how Jim failed to mention all the ways God's grace factored in. The grace that he and his family experienced beginning the very moment he found Carol Ann face down in the pasture and continuing on to this day. Bill shared the countless ways God was present with him and with his family, some of them unbelievable. I'm going to give you a few glimpses of that thread of hope that was mysteriously woven throughout Bill's and his family's pain and suffering, making the rest of the story very different from how Jim finished the story in his first draft. Bill relayed that 2 weeks before Carol Ann's death, the family took a trip to Yellowstone. Bill and Carol Ann went exploring alone in the car. After crossing a narrow path, Carol Ann saw a herd of mountain goats, and Bill had a long fascination with mountain goats, so they pulled over to watch them. When they got back in the car, Carol Ann remembered reading a Bible verse about mountain goats once. Bill asked her to find it, and she eventually did in the Old Testament in the book of Job. Remember the book opens with that horrific scene where God-loving Job loses everything in a tsunami of loss. His children, his home, his possessions, and health. In the next several chapters, Job's friends are trying to explain away why all this happened to him, and they are well off the mark. Job regrettably starts buying into what they're telling him, and that's when God steps in. Silencing everyone, God speaks directly to Job, essentially telling him to quit trying to figure it out. God builds an impressive case with a litany of questions designed to show Job that God is big enough to be trusted. In Job 39:1, God asks, "Do you know when the mountain goats give birth?" The point of all the questions that I read earlier, and more, is that our understanding is vastly overestimated in comparison to the one who possesses all understanding and all knowledge. After reading from the scriptures, Bill and Carol Ann began sharing their personal spiritual journeys with one another in ways they never had before. They continued the drive, happy to be together, marveling at the beauty of creation and worshiping God together. The memory of this conversation came to Bill's mind while at Carol Ann's bedside during the remaining moments of her life. Though Carol Ann was in a coma, Bill turned to chapter 39 of Job and began reading, "Do you know when the mountain goats give birth?" Before beginning verse 2, God made God's presence known to Bill, impressing on his mind the immensity of God and reminding Bill of the unimaginable intentions Bill and Carol Ann had pondered during their glorious drive together. God was telling Bill that God was present whether it was in the best or the worst day of his life. God was present. And standing before his deceased wife, Bill remembers thinking, as horrific, disorienting, and unexplainable as it all was, he at least knew he had a mustard seed of faith to say God is real. In the days and the weeks and the months ahead, this proved to be the seed God watered, pruned, and doted on to grow a tree of shelter and hope in Bill's life. This certainly didn't soften the agony of losing Carol Ann. The recurring experience and assurance of God's presence sustained Bill and each of his children. The day after Carol Ann's death, 4-year-old Sarah Kate told Bill that moments before the accident, God told her something terrible was about to happen. To this day, Sarah Kate knows deep within her that God was present before the fall that changed her life forever. One evening, weeks after the death, Caleb came downstairs with his eyes as big as saucers. He shared how he had talked to an angel in his room. He looked down from his room out the window into the backyard, and he spotted a mysterious, homeless-looking man standing by a tree. After watching him for a while, Caleb knocked on the window, prompting the man to fly up to the second-story window and peer at Caleb through the glass. He told Caleb, "God is here with you, and you will be okay." These times of God showing up were immensely meaningful to Bill in the midst of his grief and anguish. For Jim, this was a paradox. How can suffering and healing, brokenness and wholeness, despair and hope coexist? Wasn't God supposed to ease people's pain and trials? Bill insisted he was not angry with God. And this was maddening for his friend Jim. Jim would often think, "Come on, Bill, be real. She's not even my wife and I'm angry at God." In the first draft of his story, Jim had Bill in deep depression, contemplating suicide, feeling betrayed and abandoned by God, and how his kids were the only thing keeping him alive. After reading that first draft, Bill sent this response by email. "Jim, as I read the draft, I knew I didn't feel some of the things that you wrote. I never wanted to die. I did want it all to go away. It seems incomplete to say that it was only my kids that kept me alive. There was always a sense that there was something more to all this than I could see. There was surely a hope for living that kept me going, some certainty that this was not the end. God would not abandon me there alone. There was some unexplainable trust driving me to get up and make that painful cup of coffee for one. I was never in deep depression. I was in deep anguish. I also never asked the questions you did, wondering why God would allow Carol Ann to die. I always knew there was some reason, and I would never know why, and didn't care to know. I rarely felt abandoned. Instead, I felt God's presence while at the same time feeling deep pain. I wasn't angry. I was very confused. Jim says he doesn't know what to make of Bill consistently saying God did everything and Bill did nothing. Didn't Bill need to meet God halfway? The only thing Bill would own up to doing was choosing to believe and trust with his mustard seed of faith. During one period, Bill went weeks without opening his Bible, and God kept showing up. Bill just went on trusting, grieving, fulfilling responsibilities at work and at home, hurting, caring for each of his children, weeping, but always trusting. The presence of Christ within was sufficient for Bill in ways that he had never experienced before. Walking through the darkness, there was always hope, peace, and life for Bill. There was nothing for Bill to do but believe that God's grace is, after all, amazing, amazing grace. At about the 5-year anniversary of Carol Ann's death, Bill could say he has a greater appreciation for the fragility of life. He says he is a deeper, richer, more purposeful man than ever before. He still has his days of fear and doubt and pain. He's having more days of courage, certainty, and hope. He says some days he feels he knows less about God and yet knows God more intimately than he ever imagined possible. Jim says he was discouraged that he was so skeptical of Bill's experience with God initially. Today, Jim is able to see that God is there even if he himself cannot feel or quite trust that presence. Maybe God is not offended by human doubt and fear. Maybe God longs to help us, and more important, is able to help us. Jim is able to see more clearly now why God allowed him to stand on the edge of Bill's journey through his darkness. He feels his own mustard seed of faith growing. His own question has been answered. Yes, I want to know that God that is trustworthy, that stays there, that's always there. What lessons might we learn from this story and the story of Job? What did you hear in the story that struck a chord in you? Maybe a memory, maybe a doubt, or a fear, maybe a hope. Maybe from Bill's experience we can learn that God is real. God was right there with Bill. Can we believe that without feeling God's presence? We learned that Jim's skepticism kept him from being open to God's presence in his own life. Do we do that at all? Are there ever times when we just don't believe in the presence? For me, as I read this story, I was reminded that back when my life changed forever and my husband's leaving, I learned God was right there with me like a mother, taking care of me before I even knew I needed help. God was there providing people I needed before I even knew I needed them. We can learn that God is leading, guiding, directing, and all we have to do is be open to God, even just a little bit, even as big as a mustard seed of faith. I was at a retreat a few weeks ago where I admitted that I was struggling with understanding what is love. And I know the scriptures say God is love, and Jesus says to love others as yourself, to love our neighbors, all of that love stuff in there, but I could not understand a definition of love that made sense to me. A little over a week ago, I was reading Brian McLaren's book, Do I Stay Christian? A book that Jane recommended. I'm in the third part where it says where it talks about how to be Christian, how to stay Christian. And in there he talks about the desire for a healthy planet, the desire for goodness for people all around us, and even the desire for goodness for myself is all a part of the desire of the universal divine. God is love. It says so in 1 John 4, God is love. And that's what it's all about. I never doubted God. I just couldn't understand this love thing. And I think it's just because I'm moving into another phase of my spiritual journey. That there are stages of faith. Richard Rohr talks about the first half of life spirituality and the second half of life spirituality. The first half of life talks about building a container, the do's and don'ts of faith, the yeses and nos, the 10 commandments of faith. This is how you do faith. The second half of life is the non-dualistic thinking, the yes and rather than but. And yes and. Yes, I can have doubts and I can have faith. Instead of, if I have doubts, I have no faith. Then I have no faith. It's all about the Beatitudes of faith. The blessed are they who. McLaren has 4 stages in his book from simplicity to harmony. Simplicity, I can't remember the other 2 right now. But harmony is where we understand that it's the divine love that drives us, that calls us into caring for the planet, for others, and for ourselves. And I came out of reading that particular section of the book, laying the book down, and thinking, this is like being a fish in water. You know, if I was a fish in water, I wouldn't understand what water is. I wouldn't know what it is. I wouldn't have a name maybe even for it, water. But yet it's the thing that gives me life and calls me to live and to eat and to procreate and all of those kinds of things. So today I'm a fish. I'm a fish in water. And I just invite you to think for yourselves, what else might we learn from this story and for the story of Job? That's the question that I'm going to leave for you all today. And I end that with an amen. Amen.